we're looking at some, I just want to now show you a bit of a demonstration. They did a study and they showed a video with some emotional content, both to adolescents and to adults. And they showed where that was being processed. And you can see that in the, with the adolescent, it was being processed in the amygdala. That's how the emotions were being filtered through. That's kids playing a video game who suddenly believe they're in the midst of the game, right? That they're living it. Or at a movie or something. Whereas the adults could kind of use that prefrontal cortex that was a little bit more mature and say, you know, this is kind of neat, but I can tell it's a movie, it's a game, I'm not being drawn in as deeply to the emotions of that. So again, they talk about adolescents going along full blast with emotions, but not having the judgment, not having the sort of the brakes to slow themselves down. One of the scientists that's studying the brain, Maziotta, says, the brain's working constantly to try to get itself to do something and not to do others. So he talks about development in terms of progressive inhibition. It doesn't mean we become, you know, anxious and not able to do anything, but we begin to have a prefrontal cortex that can inhibit some of the voices from the hypothalamus, some of the behaviors that go along. Jay Geed says, adolescents have passion and strength, but no brakes, and they may not get good breaks until about age 25. So that's really what the research is saying in terms of where that full maturity comes. So one of the challenges, I think, for parents and for teachers in this is to really be consistent. I've heard things where, and the research talks about it too, where we look at our kids and they're 15 or they're 17 and they're big, right? They're big bodies and big feet and they look really mature and we say, we're preparing you for the real world, and we are. But they're actually, their brain has to catch up. And so, again, I don't want to ever be the kind of parent or teacher that says, you know, the child or the student says to me, well, miss, like my prefrontal cortex isn't developed, so what could you expect, right? Like we're not opening the door to that. But we are going to try to be aware of that development and use that awareness in our parenting and in our teaching. One of the ways that we might do that is to think about, and the research also talks about this, we become effectively models of that prefrontal cortex. So I was chatting with my daughter tonight about something. She has a dilemma about, she's not sure what to do. And I said, what do you think you should do? Well, I could do this or I could do this. Okay. And who do you need to talk to make that decision? Right? You've made this commitment or that. We can act as the prefrontal cortex as teachers and as parents so that we help our kids begin to formulate their thinking that way. The last bit before we have a bit of a chatting break here is when you look at that face, what do you see? Emotion. What emotion do you see? Sorry. Fear. Okay. Shock, surprise. The woman listed did a study, fairly small study, but still it's quoted a lot out of the States, where she showed this face to adults and she showed it to adolescents. And 100% of the adults in her sample said fear, which in fact is what she was going for. And only about 50% of the adolescents, particularly 11 to 13, said fear. They had a bunch of other emotions that they saw when they looked at that face. And so as she continued to follow these adolescents in the study and watch them grow, she found that as they got older, they got better able to nail the facial expression emotions. So it's just another part of the maturing of our kids. And it's again, as teachers and as parents, you know, if we understand that sometimes our kids may not be reading our faces, what are we going to do about that? Can we identify, I'm feeling a little angry, I'm feeling a little frustrated, give me a moment, I'm really excited. You know, we start to name those faces, then our kids know. Now, the kids we live with probably pick up on our faces, but I'm thinking also more of us at school as we work with kids. Because sometimes you work really intensely with a student, and as a teacher you care deeply and you're pouring yourself into that, and the student walks away and says, you know, my teacher hates me, my teacher doesn't like there's just some, they don't read that face and they see that caring and concern in some other emotion. And they go home and say to their parents, you know, my teacher doesn't really like me. And it's such a shock as a teacher to hear that. But when you look at the research and the maturation and what's going on, oh, that's kind of interesting. It makes some sense. So naming what's going on so that our students understand, our children understand. I've talked a lot. We've talked about pruning and myelination. We've talked about the hypothalamus and the amygdala and the prefrontal cortex and some of the implications of that. So there's been a lot of material. Brain research would say you need to chat a little about that so you can move it to your long-term memory. So the way that I'd like to do that is if you could take 6 or 7 steps, because getting up and moving is actually a really good thing to do as well. If you feel you can. If not, that's fine. But if you could, take 7 steps, find someone you haven't maybe chatted with tonight, and just talk about 1 or 2 ideas that stood out for you so far. And there'll be a little timer counting down, and then we'll get back and sort of wrap up the last bit. In addition to all the sort of physical changes and physiological changes that are going on, there are also some interesting chemical pieces that I want to talk to you about tonight. And the one that I think is most important is the idea of dopamine. Dopamine is a neurotransmitter. That means it helps signals move between cells, and so messages pass through the brain using these neurotransmitters. And dopamine especially is sort of that neurotransmitter that makes you feel pretty good. Let's do this just for a moment. Just close your eyes just for a moment. Trust me on this. I want you to think about a place you feel really good in, your happy place, the beach that you love to lie on, or the cottage you love to visit, cabin you love to visit. Just think about that just for a minute. Okay, I'm going to bring you back, sadly, from that place. And as I was looking at you doing that, a few of you were smiling, so it must have been working. You can actually create your own dopamine secretions by thinking happy thoughts. And so that's what we just sort of tried to do there. But what's interesting for our kids is that dopamine is a sort of, I feel really good neurotransmitter, and it's very active in adolescence. And our body produces these neurotransmitters naturally. And our body is all about balance, homeostasis, staying at the same level. And really, fundamentally, we're also all quite lazy. Our body will do, our systems will do the least that it has to do. Pardon me. So what that means in terms of this would be, for example, if you enjoy drinking coffee, coffee has caffeine in it. Caffeine acts as artificially as one of these neurotransmitters, speeds things up, makes you feel pretty good. So if your body can come to count on by a certain time every morning, it's going to get a huge dump of caffeine, then it thinks to itself, I actually don't need to create this. I'm just going to wait for it to come in artificially. And so that is what starts to breed those cravings, right? It's whatever time, and I haven't had my coffee. And that's our body craving that. And so we don't produce as much, and the caffeine comes in, and homeostasis is established, and life goes on, and it's all smooth. I'm not a coffee drinker, but I have to confess I'm a bit of a Diet Coke addict. I need one, and I need it by a certain time before lunch. And that's really sad to say, but I know that this is the process that goes through. When you try to quit drinking coffee, has anyone tried that? And lived to tell about it? What starts to... Every morning, yeah, till 7. What starts to happen? Headaches. Yeah, absolutely. So what happens is your body says, wait a second, where's the caffeine dump? But the good news is after a week or two, it will start to reproduce that neurotransmitter again. But it's in the 2-week time that you sort of have to live through and move through. The teen brain is particularly sensitive to dopamine and craves sort of that euphoric thrill. So we talked about risk-taking as being one of those mysteries that we weren't entirely sure about. So thinking happy thoughts, falling in love, taking a risk, these all release dopamine. Hooking up with a boy or girl you like sends a dopamine rush. It feels good. Also excitement and danger release dopamine. So you can see that teens are looking for novelty and excitement and are at risk because sometimes they're looking for love to be sort of trite in all the wrong places. Dopamine is a brain chemical that's involved in motivation. So we have to be conscious of this sort of need, and it starts to play out a little bit when we think about drugs and alcohol. Just as I gave you the example with caffeine, right? alcohol can act as, drugs and alcohol can give up to 5 times sort of the rush or the pleasurable feeling that our natural dopamine can. And so we, as we have a drink, start to get used to having that in our system. That's why as adults, maybe you'll think, man, you know, when I first had a glass of wine, that kind of went to my head, and now it takes, fill in the number, 3, 6, I don't know. So that happens with teens as well, that they start and then they need more and more to get the same rush or the same feeling. Particularly, we can notice that in addiction and drug addiction. And some of the research would say that our teens are sensitive to, like their brains are sensitive because of this wanting to have dopamine to drug and alcohol addiction at that age and at that stage. So we can see how that starts to have an impact. The other piece is sort of this cycle of disinhibition. When you drink alcohol, the first place it goes to is your prefrontal cortex. Remember, that's the voice of reason. That's the development of inhibition. This is true for us as adults, by the way, as well. And so kids like this. We like that to sort of lessen the social tension and feel a little good about ourselves. But it's problematic, right? Because if I'm a teenager and I'm drinking and it's going to my prefrontal cortex, I haven't got a whole lot of voice of reason going on. So I may be more inclined to step behind the wheel of a car. And I may be more inclined to go home with somebody I shouldn't. Right? And so those are things that we need to kind of pay attention to as we think about our teens, because the drugs and alcohol are impacting the prefrontal cortex, and it's a little bit behind anyway in terms of its development. Lawrence Steinberg is a researcher, and he actually wrote the parent piece that I put at the end for you. But he did a research out of Temple University on risk. Really interesting. He was looking at studying adults and adolescents and whether they would run in a simulated experiment a yellow light. What he found was whether it was an adult or an adolescent on their own in the vehicle, it was almost identical. And very rarely would they run a yellow light. And then he put them in the vehicle with friends or colleagues or peers. And what happened was the adult behavior didn't really change much, and the adolescent behavior changed significantly. And I think that our provinces have figured this out in terms of this graduated driving, right? They're starting to see that it's when you put, I've heard even some research quote, 4 kids in the car is equal to so many drinks, because it starts to disinhibit. And when there's peer pressure, there's more likelihood of taking a risk. And we know that as parents and as teachers. Some of the possible impacts of alcohol. Decision making and risk taking, we've talked about that. Binge drinking. They've looked at alcohol and binging mainly in rats, and they can see that there is some permanent brain damage in rats. So there's really a strong urge to our kids to not be doing this, because you only get one brain, and we want to keep it as best we can. Blackouts are linked to memory and the hypothalamus, which is another part of the brain that we haven't talked about tonight, and that may be an indication of disrupting neural growth. And there's a subtle, the research would say there's a subtle difference in adolescence between those who abuse and depend on alcohol and those that are just doing it for fun. And so we need to keep our eyes on our kids and really have those conversations, those prefrontal cortex conversations about consequences and things. I'm going to skip over gender because we're running out of time, and I just want to touch on one more piece, and we will come back to gender, I promise you. But there's a lot of mixed research, and I really need more time to share that than I have, I think. The last thing I want to talk about is resilience, because I think we need to move from, wow, these are the brains we're living with, that's a pretty tricky story, to some hopefulness, and there is a great deal of hopefulness. So resilience, as we look at resilience in research, is sort of defined by having inner strength and external supports. And a lot of the research would talk about being in community, in a positive community where you're accepted and welcomed, creates huge resilience that kids will take with them for the rest of their lives. Again, making me thankful that we're here having that conversation.